So my task was to talk about behavioural measures and give you an introduction to behavioural measures and sort of give a bit of the background there. But I figure I'll start with a bit of a motivation because my understanding is that we have a bit of a mixed disciplinary background, people from film, people from cognitive sciences, people from humanities. So I'll talk a little bit about why we measure attention at all. Just sort of a quick run through on that. And then I'll lead a little bit more into the notion of attention in cognitive science. And rather than focusing just on the measures, I'll talk a little bit about the big questions in cognitive science and how they came up and how that relates back to our motivations. And it's in this context that I'll talk about the paradigms that got used or that developed alongside of these questions as people became more interested in attention and as attention became a more relevant thing to study within cognitive sciences. And it's here that I'll really do my job of saying something about behavioural measures. So this is more of a bit of a background, a bit of stage setting for the rest of the day, and hopefully I can foreshadow some of the other talks. So why measure attention? I don't need to motivate this too much, but just a few points. One of the things that's interesting for me, as somebody who's becoming increasingly interested in autism, is clinical conditions. And of course, ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is definitely relevant for understanding attention. And here, we want to understand attention because we want to understand mechanisms for intervention. We want to understand how attention can go wrong, how we can fix attention. More so to my interests is autism spectrum disorders. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about some of my research. But you also see differences in attention in autism. You see restricted interests, which may be attention driven. You see repetitive behaviours. Attention to special things is one of the common features and common characteristics of autism. But there's also research in more perceptually driven research and some cognitive research suggesting that some kinds of attention might be an area of skill in autism. So understanding these areas of skill might be helpful in understanding how to utilise them in classroom settings and in workplace settings and so on. Safety and performance is also relevant and becoming more relevant as the workplace changes. So in the old days, mining was a very risky job because you'd use something like this drill to drill it into the bedrock, and that would create a lot of dust and create a lot of injuries and create a lot of lung disease, and that was a dangerous environment to be in. Mining is actually still a really dangerous environment to be in, and the university where I did my psychology degree had a very strong organisational human factors background, and one of the things that we learned there was that attention is something that's really good to study, particularly in the mines, because mines don't look like this anymore. Now they look like this. They're essentially these big, long, spiralling roads going down underground to pick up the ore, and the problem is that people crash trucks all the time, well, with a surprisingly high rate, because you have to sit for a very, very long time just holding the wheel. So how do you make people not have lapses in attention? How do you understand fatigue? How do you decrease accidents in the mining industry? How do you decrease human error in aviation and things like that? Another sort of more general, more humanistically motivated reason to think that attention is something that's interesting goes right back to one of the first psychologists, generally, one of the first psychologists that highlighted the importance of attention. And that's William James, and this is something that I'll come back to a few times. So William James has this really nice quote about attention, where he says that the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over and over again is the very root of judgment, character and will. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it's easier to define this idea than to give practical directions for bringing it about. So you see attention coming up as not just a faculty that James was studying in his psychology, but also as a core concept for all of William James's philosophy. And I'll say a little bit more about that as we go on. But the point with this quote is that if we have a good knowledge about attention, and we have a good knowledge about its constraints and what it can be used for, what it can't be used for, then we can have a good education. And in the context of the philosophy that William James was trying to develop, this was actually a really central and important piece. So James's context was early American pragmatism. And in early American pragmatism, there was, even though it's a philosophy, it had a very strong political agenda. And its very strong political agenda was to promote the freedom and agency of individuals in order to promote democracy by improving education. So if we can improve education, we'll have better citizens. So fields like philosophy, fields like psychology shouldn't just be theoretical, they should be applied. And education's really just training of the mind. So this is why William James invented a psychology, because we require a science of the mind, we require empirical science of the mind to improve our education system. And so that's why the early American pragmatists were interested in establishing psychology as the science, because they're interested in using this science to develop a systematic pedagogy. So attention in this system, in this way of thinking, in this philosophy, has a very, very core important function, has a very important conceptual role to play. And that's to ground people's will and agency. And William James actually has a definition of agency that's been used in the cognitive neuroscience literature in the last 10 years, and that's attention to intentions. So for everything, for William James, everything comes back down to attention being the sort of where your agency rests, or one of the main pillars of your agency. So William James gave us a definition at the outset, in the early days of psychology, that was designed to fit into this conceptual role that attention had. And this definition has two parts. One part is the adjustment of the sensory organs, so that's like moving your eyes, which we'll hear a lot more about, or cocking your ears, or using some sort of bodily movement in order to go pick up the information that you're interested in. And the other part is an anticipatory preparation for what the sense organs are about to receive. So in that sense, attention isn't just something passive for James. And to illustrate what this means, because this could be a little bit too theoretical and obtuse, but to illustrate what this means, he stole an example from William Helmholtz. And William Helmholtz's example is attending to the G overtone when you play a C. So if you play a key on a piano, if you press a C, then you don't get this even wave, you get something that looks like this, which has got sort of mixtures of fundamental frequency with harmonics in it. And that's what gives the instrument its timbre. And if you play a C, well, what you hear is the C, and that's the first overtone of the note. But mixed up in there is also the second overtone, the second harmonic, and the third harmonic. And you can hear that G. But it'll be easier to hear that. So this is sort of the first priming study ever conducted was Helmholtz's. If you play the G first, and then play the C, it'll be easier for you to hear the G and the C. So the idea here is that you can hear it, but only if you know what to attend to. And if you've been primed, you'll hear it even more strongly. And so, in a way, you have to have a template of the G in mind before you get the stimulus coming in. And this is what James means by some sort of anticipatory preparation for G, for this G note. So from this, we can start off with a reasonable general definition of what we mean when we talk about attention. And this changes depending on the traditions that you're working within. Attention actually is a surprisingly difficult thing to define. But I like Christopher Moll, he's a philosopher. He wrote a book on attention, lots of papers on attention, and he's written the Stanford Encyclopedia for Philosophy entry on attention, and that's very good. But he defines attention as a directed selectivity of mental life. So this is taking basically from William James. Where selectivity means engaging with something, or some category, or some thought, or some activity rather than others. So excluding others by focusing on one thing. That's the focus side, the selective side of attention. And the other side is the directedness. Attention's directed. Attention's directed at something, and it has some end in mind, or it has some mental template that it's working against. And that's what you see with the Helmholtz example. So that's just building directly on James as a starting definition. And I think that this idea, or this quote, or this thought that William James had in early pragmatism is actually very relevant to what we understand as attention today, and what we see as being important about attention today, and the way that we talk about attention today. because there's been an increasing discourse, given changes in information technology and how much information is available to us, that technology might be ruining our attention span. So it's taking something away from us, that we always have a phone that we have to pay attention to. We're always dividing our attention between multiple tasks. We never have time to focus anymore. We never read books anymore. We never even watch movies anymore. We do two things at once all the time. But why is our attention span so important? Why is it some sort of necessary condition of humanity that we have a long attention span? If it's actually adaptive to us to be able to navigate in this information technological society with lots and lots of inputs and being able to do two things at once, then that's a good thing. But I think that the underlying implication here is that it's not just the attention span that we're losing, we're also losing something else that's fundamental that William James sort of ticked onto when he said that attention is fundamental to a kind of mental agency. It's a source of our mental agency. So if we're worried about technology ruining our attention span, then that's because we're worried about our psychological agency being undermined by our context. Okay, so that's a bit of the background of why I think attention is an important thing. It does have these sort of obvious, direct application talking about attention. Attention, it's not like we had a change from behaviorism and now we can talk about mental life, so now let's come up with a theory of attention. It's kind of like early cognitive scientists backed into the notion of attention without necessarily wanting to revive it. And early cognitive scientists emerged, mostly and largely driven by the emergence of digitized communication, the emergence of telephone systems, the emergence of cryptography. It wasn't it wasn't just these practical implications and practical applications that sparked cognitive science on their own. It was the need to explain these things that you see in early cognitive scientists like Alan Turing. These things needed a theory. These new modes of communication needed a theory. And that theory was modern information theory, the Shannon and Weaver model of communication. And the idea is that you have a sender who packages some information by structuring it, by organising it, by creating negative informational entropy, sends it through a channel that then gets decoded on reception and gets received and understood. And that meaning gets unpacked after it's been packaged and sent through a channel. And Shannon and Weaver came up with founded the whole domain of theory to explain this process. And it didn't take too long before this was immediately applied in psychology, in early cognitive psychology. And one of the first places that you see it being applied is actually in attention research, even though at the time it wasn't called attention research. So this is from Donald Broadbent, who in 1958 in Cambridge wrote a book called Perception and Communication, and the explicit point was to use this model of communication to understand perception. So the idea is understand perception and cognition by analogy to this information theory that was being developed. But the point wasn't to theorise about attention, and initially he resisted theorising about attention. And what he wanted to explain was, if we have lots of sensory information, lots of sensory channels, how do we select which one to prioritise and to decode? Because we don't just have one sender when we're an agent going around in the world with information. We have lots and lots of senders. We have lots of informational sources to pick up. And all of this research started with dichotic listening, so sort of the simplest case, where you have one source of information in one ear, another source of information in the other ear. How do you select between the two? Well, they compete with one another in a filter that reduces that information to something that short-term memory can store information about. And so suddenly we see attention having a conceptual function again. And so because there was a conceptual function there, attention sort of went into that function, played that functional role within theories. And that was to explain this perceptual filtering process. So immediately you see selectivity becoming important again, but not so much directiveness in this beginning period. And this conceptual function that attention played was a bottleneck. To theorise about the bottleneck that occurs in information processing when you're interacting with the world. And that led to sort of the first big question that got asked in attention research, and it's still a fairly big question today as far as I understand it. is where is this bottleneck located in the information processing stream? So the two options for the first class of models was that it's either early or late. And by early or late, that means is information selected for prior to being given as some sort of semantic analysis, prior to its meaning being interpreted by the receiver, or is it selected for after the meaning's been interpreted from the signal? So early versus late selection. So if you can imagine a dichotic listening task, you're listening to two sources of information, two stories being told. Do you process the information in those stories first, before you then select for one that you can then report on, or do you pick one to focus on, and only one of those channels gets into short-term memory and the ability to report that information? So from here, we sort of, with this big question in place, we get to the next landmark. And this landmark is feature integration theory. And this has been a very important theory, a very important sort of starting off point for lots of computational models of attention that are still being developed today. So if we have this big question, where's the bottleneck in attention? Is it pre or post semantic analysis? The answer that Treisman and, I never know how to say his name, Gallade? I thought it was, yeah, Gallade. Treisman and Gallade in 1980, the answer that they gave was a very novel one, because their answer was that, well, you actually have both, and it depends. You have early selection for objects, but late selection for features. So there's two key innovations that come out of explaining this in this way. One is that you have preattentive processing in parallel for features, but you have a spotlight of attention for objects. So this is easiest to explain if you see the stimuli and the task and the behavioural measure that Treisman and Gallade used to test this theory initially, and that's a visual search paradigm. So you have to find the green X as quickly as possible. Put your hand up as soon as you see a green X. So that's fairly easy. What's interesting is you still have to find the green X now. That's still fairly easy. You're about as quick. If you were doing this properly, you'd be about as quick as you were before. Slightly more difficult because of the screen resolution, but find the red S. Yeah, actually not too bad. Okay, now find the red S again. Yeah, it works. Good. Okay, now we're back.
People can read here. That was the test.
People can read. Yeah.
Or at least identify letters.
They can identify forms.
Forms.
Okay, so that's not really what's happening here is it doesn't seem to matter how many X's there are. The S you'll find just as quickly no matter what. You can have a page full of S's, or not. Sorry, a page full of X's or not many X's, and the S pops out at you. The feature pops out at you. And this is where the design gets interesting, and this is what's really innovative about the paradigm that Treisman pioneered. Now you have to go back to the X. Now you're finding the green X again. A bit harder. What's really interesting is not just that that's harder, but how much harder this is. So this task is dependent on the set size, whereas the other task, the simple features, aren't dependent on the set size. So it matters how many distractors I have on the screen here, but it didn't matter before. And here's the classic figure from the original paper. So what's going on here? Well, the explanation is that you actually have, if you're given this stimulus and you have to find, say, this green square, you have lots of feature maps in the early visual system. And for each of those feature maps, you'll get that pop-out effect, like what was happening before, or when there was just the green X. But when you put them together, you don't get the pop-out. It's like you overlay them imagine a glass plate, and you put all of those feature maps together and you don't get the pop out anymore. So what you have to do is you have to have an attentional spotlight that goes around and searches for the target that you're interested in. And there's been lots and lots and lots of ways of formulating that theory. But that's sort of the essence of all. And so here you get feature perception, features being selected preattentively. But here you need to use attention to go and find the object. So this is a very much a changing notion of attention. This is a real break with the older notion of attention as a bottleneck. Because now we have a new concept which is preattentive processing that doesn't have the bottleneck in it. So this is adding a new innovation. So if you're given the task find the elephant, that happens fairly easy because you've got a colour map that you can use to find the elephant, and you can find it based on its colour salience. And this is all this can all happen preattentively. But if you're told to find the elephant, you'll also be guiding your search. You'll also have at the same time this preattentive bottom up and this attentive bottom down process, this spotlight that says, well, I need to find the grey object, and I'll look around the scene for that. The spotlight of attention will move around the scene and find the grey element. And what's interesting is that in people with autism, this is one of the results that actually got me into studying autism, is that you'll notice here that this figure with the circles looks a lot like the figure that I showed you before from the Treisman study, where if it's features on their own, the green X in the field of red X's, they'll pop out, and it doesn't matter how many there are, there can be 25, 15 or 5, you'll be just as quick to find them. But if you get this feature conjunction, where you've got to find one item that shares two features with its destructors in the background, you have to do a guided search around your feature maps, then you take longer and longer. But not if you're autistic. So if you're autistic, you're just as quick to find the feature conjunction.
Is that where you had both a lot of S's and X's and colors?
Yep. So if I had a room full of autistic people, according to this figure, and I said, you can see how much harder this is now, and I press the button, then everyone would just put their hands up. Or if you're an engineer, actually. I've done that with engineers. I've had a class full of engineers, and it's, yeah.
Is there a causal correlation?
Yeah, and there's the whole Baron Cohen thing with AQ, and so there's two interpretations of this, and this is some of my unpublished research with Carsten. One is that when you present a neurotypical person with this, what they see is actually like this, and it just pops out automatically. So that means that feature conjunctions, or implies, or maybe suggests that feature conjunctions are processed preattentively in ASD, that these feature maps interact in a different kind of way. That you don't need to engage guided search because there's a special perceptual skill that people with autism have. The other interpretation is that if you present neurotypicals with something like this, it's actually processed by people with autism like this. That they're using guided search here as well, but they have an advantage in their guided search. Their guided search is quicker. And there's a study in a naturalistic environment by Liz Pelicano that suggests that this could be the case. That, well, I won't talk about that study because I'm sort of short on time. I'll talk about my study. So one's an enhancement in guided search, the other one's an enhancement in preattentive processing, and it could be either the one or the other. So we've conducted a study two studies to distinguish between these two hypotheses. So the idea is to try to present the stimuli preattentively and exclude guided search as much as we possibly can, and then measure people's ability to discriminate features. And so hypothesis one would be that discriminability for feature conjunctions will be better in people with ASD. So they should be better at discriminating these feature conjunctions, where the target shares the properties of two different kinds of distractors, or their discriminability for simple features should be worse, where the target only shares one feature with its distractors. They should actually be worse at this task if you don't allow them to use guided search. I was betting on this one before I ran the study. So what stimuli did we use? Well, here's the form search. You have to find the cross amongst the T's, and the conjunction search was that you have to find the cross amongst the T's again, but now there's some red crosses. And then we varied the size of the crossbar here and the shade of the red here until for both features people were performing around 65% chance to try to take guided search out of the equation as much as possible. And then presented it really quickly. So instead of presenting it on the screen like before and giving people lots of time to respond, we presented a fixation cross, then we presented the stimulus, and that either had the target in it or it didn't. Then we had a bit of a blank screen, and then presented the stimulus again very quickly, and that, again, either had the target or not, but the target only appeared in one of these two intervals. So it was either here or it was here, but not in both. And then the question was, when did the target appear, the first time or the second time? So here we had two conditions. It was either the simple feature task, the cross with the T's, and we varied how big the set size was of the display, and we measured people's ability to discriminate between those two trials. And so for hypothesis 1, we should expect something that looks like this, where people get better at discriminability for the conjunction task than the neurotypicals would be. For the second hypothesis, we expect something like this, where autistic people get worse for the form task, the easier task. So that, again, both are the same, just like in the reaction time studies, but instead, in one hypothesis, they're the same because they're better for the hard one. In the second hypothesis, they're the same because they're worse for the easy one. And what we actually found was that the second hypothesis was supported. People with ASD were actually worse at discriminating on the simple features. And that was surprising, so we ran it again with a different kind of stimulus and found the same result. And that was surprising, so we ran it again, except we didn't threshold people at 65%, now we thresholded them at 85%, so that they had a better chance of catching the stimulus and using guided search, and the effect went away. So Carsten and I will write that up. So that supports this second interpretation, maybe that autistic people are using guided search all the time, they're very routine in guided search. And this is a super important theory, and a super influential theory, because it's sort of the root of something called salience models of attention. And I think Jakob said he might talk a little bit about this when it turns to a little bit about this. Okay. And as you can see, salience models of attention within computational models of attention takes up a lot of the space of different kinds of models you can get. Okay, so on from the bottleneck, this raises another big question. Because now we're not only interested in the selectivity, now we've actually got the directedness, because we've got a spotlight of attention that we've got control over. So agency starts to come back into the story. And attention, this concept of attention, gets a new functional role, and that is to control this attentional spotlight. That's something that people can do as well. So that leads to the second big question that sort of came up historically in attention research. What controls this spotlight? Well, the answer is, in the same year as Treisman studies, is Posner, who, in a very to cut it to its core, what controls the spotlight? What controls the spotlight? Either the environment or the agent controls the spotlight. They're two things. That's the sort of starting point. This can, of course, become a very complex story, and it has become a very complex story, and lots of theories gone into this, but essentially it's the environment or the agent can control the spotlight. Because the key innovation here, I think, is the notion of exogenously cued or endogenously cued changes in attention, or attentional focus, or the spotlight, where the spotlight goes. So again, this is always sort of easiest to come back to the paradigm. I tried this and it didn't look as good, didn't think it worked as well in this context, but we'll see. So the idea here is that you have to respond left or right when you see the star appear, and again as quickly and accurately as possible. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know why. I'm setting this up wrong. I don't design queuing studies. But the idea is that that's actually not supposed to make you faster, but it makes you slower. So maybe Matthias can explain what I'm doing wrong.
It has something to do with inhibition of return.
Yeah, okay.
It's
Yeah.
the
It's the square
the
that has to be.
the interstimulus interval between the circle and the star is too long. So it has to be faster.
Yeah, that's what I thought, right?
Yeah.
That's as quick as you can get it in PowerPoint.
That's
I knew
the
something
problem.
was going
That's
wrong.
the problem.
That's as quick as you can get it in PowerPoint. So you can't do this in PowerPoint. I knew there was an answer. But it actually slows you down. But if you do it properly, again in the right conditions, that would speed you up. And the idea is that the environment is cueing you to orient to one of the two locations. So the environment's telling you where it's giving you some information that is controlling the spotlight for you. And the third one, which is sort of the most... No, second one, sorry. So, yeah, that was a lot of time. but here, you'll be quicker as well. And the idea there is that you've got endogenous queuing. This was in the original Posner formulation. I'm not sure how endogenous this is, but the arrow gives you a top-down signal that you can then use to tell, which then tells you where you should look next. And then the third one, which wasn't in the original paper, I don't think, is this one. Left. And the idea here is that there's also an arousal mechanism that arouses you more to pay attention, so that your spotlight, control of your spotlight speeds up, generally.
I will talk a lot about on the bed on Wednesday. That's the basic of the research. Why does that work?
Yes, why does that work? And that's why I'm very annoyed I can't make it. But these are the three categories, and there's so much theory and so much research that has gone into this and can go into this and continue to go into this. But these are the sort of the three categories that Posner's played a big part in mapping out. And again, this is another kind of endogenous cueing. This is your arousal, an internal state, controlling where your spotlight goes. So this has a very very strong, very broad legacy, just like Treisman. As far as I can understand, the concept of executive function is very much, or the development and the introduction of the idea of executive function is very much linked to this paradigm and linked to this problem. Neurocognitive models of attention have become quite prolific. There's lots available. There's lots of work can be done, is being done, has been done on this. I think this also influenced what we talked about with our last workshop. This idea of different networks in the brain, because you've got this orienting network, which is from the outside. There's a brain network for that. You've got this endogenous control, executive. There's a brain network for that, and there's a brain network for the arousal, and they all control where your attention goes on any given task. And this idea of having different networks that can do different things with attention planted the seeds of default mode research that then came along. Because what happens if you're not doing anything with your attention? What's your brain doing there? And this idea of endogenously controlled and exogenously controlled brain activity also played a role in the earlier papers and the earlier ideas surrounding the default mode network. And I think Posner was even involved with Rakel right at that stage, because they did the subtractive stuff together, and I think Posner was even involved and influenced Stephen Peterson and Mark Rakel in the earlier, really early formulations of the default mode. Relations between cognition and emotion in the brain, another ad for tomorrow. That's with Matthias Miller. Very heavy influence on cognitive neuroscience, and very heavy influence on stress and mindfulness research. So that's another big strand of research that came out of these early days. So this is my shortcut through what I call a cognitivist model of attention, the idea of information processing model of attention, the computational theory of the mind as applied to attention. And the idea here is that attention, well, at least in the early days, is not a process, but the result of a system limitation. started out as this bottleneck in perception, and to solve a problem in understanding perception. To solve a problem, if we think of perception as an information processing system, what are some of its features? And attention just sort of fell out of that translation. And one of the early lessons was that some processes can function in parallel, but some must be serial, and there's been a lot of time devoted to fleshing out that idea. And when we sort of get to the Posner days, when we get to the idea of guided search and guided attention, the question becomes, what's the relationship between the environment and the agent themselves, or internal cognitive states and external environmental states, in controlling the things that must be serial? Because you can only process one thing at a time, by definition, it's serial. So the environment plays a part in that. That's the orienting network. We play a part in that. That's the executive network. But there's also an interaction between the environment and us, in the sense that the environment can influence our non-cognitive mental states, our emotional states, that has an influence on our attention. So all of what I've said is sort of continue a little bit just for the people from humanities amongst us. All of this works if you go back to broadband and buy into that original idea that the mind is a kind of computer. So this is something that was very explicit and very explicitly worked out in Posner. Exactly, Posner spent a lot of time arguing for mental chronometry, arguing for why reaction times are an interesting thing to look at when you're doing cognitive science. Because computational processes take time, so we should be designing tasks where we have an idea of what sort of computational processes are involved, and then subtract the computational processes that we think are involved to produce behaviours on those tasks. And that was something that's obvious to everybody now in the field, but it's not obvious to people who aren't in the field, and it wasn't obvious before those ideas were fleshed out. And Posner was one of the people who fleshed those ideas out. Incidentally, he applied the same analysis and same way of thinking with Rakel to come up with subtractive methodologies. That's the foundation of lots of early cognitive neuroimaging, and lots of cognitive neuroimaging even still today. So it's something that we take for granted, but this idea that the mind is a computer and that mental chronometry is the right way to get at it, and that mental chronometry is the right way to get at attention and perception and cognition, hasn't always been obvious. And I don't think it's something that William James was necessarily thinking about, but who knows. But what happens if we don't buy that metaphor anymore? And there's lots of people within cognitive science who don't actually buy that metaphor anymore and say that the mind isn't a computer. More people from philosophy, but they're creeping more and more into cognitive science. So what happens if we're not cognitivists, and what happens if the mind's not a computer program? Then what's attention? Or if we're not computationalists anymore, if we don't believe that the mind is a computer program, then what do we believe? What's our new paradigm? Or do we not have a paradigm? Do we end up in a sort of a strange situation in cognitive science where we're sort of in a strange paradigm-free period that looks kind of like postmodernism? Or at least a strange period where we have weak theoretical paradigms, where we're not strongly committing to the idea that the mind is a computer program anymore, but we are strongly committing to the idea of mental chronometry and these experimental paradigms that we're using, which are all founded on the idea that the mind's a computer program. So we have a strong methodological commitment to this paradigm without necessarily having a strong theoretical commitment. So in a way, we're incidentally committing to theory through methodological commitments. And I think that's kind of something that's might be happening through a lot of psychological fields. So going back to James, maybe we're entering a period of neo-pragmatism. I don't know. It could be interesting to think of it that way. Where we're starting to talk about our attention in terms of agency again. Or we're starting to think about not just executive function as a computational process, but attention as something that founds our agency. And that's definitely something that I think is in sort of the more common discourses outside of science. So where my perception is my construction of the world, that's how I've constructed the world. And attention is my control over that world I construct. And so if you can control my attention, then you can control what sort of world I construct. You can control my beliefs, my desires, things like that, and my actions. But if I can control my attention, I can enhance my freedom relative to other people's control. What's interesting here in sort of the take-home message is that every psychology that we develop implies if we know what attention is, then we know how to improve it. If we know how to improve attention, we know we get sort of a loose program for education. So yeah, I think I'll stop at that on my closing philosophical note. Thank you very much.